Millions of rabbits, millions of poisonous toads, hundreds of thousands of wild camels, and all of them became a massive problem in Australia because of one thing: human decisions. Australia is home to some of the most unusual animals on Earth. For millions of years, its ecosystem developed in almost complete isolation from the rest of the world. Animals such as kangaroos, koalas, wombats, and platypuses adapted to conditions that exist almost nowhere else. But that very isolation also made Australia's wildlife extremely vulnerable to species that humans later introduced from other continents. In several cases, it all began with what seemed like a good idea, or a completely harmless one. A few rabbits were meant to provide sport for hunters. Cane toads were supposed to save the sugarcane plantations, and camels were brought in to help people conquer Australia's vast interior. At the time, no one could have imagined how much those decisions would change an entire continent. These are three incredible stories of how human intervention helped create some of the greatest ecological disasters in Australian history. The first story is about the incredible spread of rabbits in Australia, and how just a few animals grew into a massive ecological problem within only a few decades. On Christmas Day in 1859, wealthy landowner Thomas Austin had a simple wish. He wanted to enjoy rabbit hunting in Australia, just as he had in England. A group of 24 European wild rabbits was sent to him from England, and some of them were released on his Barwon Park estate in the Australian state of Victoria. It seemed completely harmless. How much damage could a few rabbits possibly cause? The answer was almost unimaginable. Australia turned out to be an almost perfect place for them to reproduce. They had an abundance of food, vast open spaces, and conditions that allowed them to multiply extremely quickly. Just a few years after the rabbits were released, their numbers had already become unbelievable. By 1866, only 7 years later, hunters had killed around 14,000 rabbits on Austin's property. But even that couldn't stop them. They began spreading across Australia at an incredible speed. By 1880, they had reached New South Wales. By 1886, they had reached Queensland. And by the end of the 19th century, they had spread all the way to Western Australia. In just a few decades, they had taken over a huge part of the continent. Their expansion is considered one of the fastest spreads of any mammal ever recorded. And then, the real disaster began. Millions of rabbits consumed enormous amounts of grass and other vegetation. In some areas, the land was left almost completely bare. Farmers were losing their crops and pastures. Australia realized it had a massive problem. But how do you stop an animal that reproduces at an incredible rate and is already spread across such a vast territory? They tried almost everything: hunting, traps, destroying rabbit warrens. At the beginning of the 20th century, they began building one of the most ambitious fences in the world, the famous rabbit-proof fence. Thousands of kilometers of fencing were meant to stop the rabbits from spreading any further. The rabbits kept spreading. By the 1920s, estimates of their population had reached as high as around 10 billion. From just a few animals released for hunting, Australia ended up with billions of rabbits in only a few decades. During the 1950s, the myxomatosis virus was introduced, dramatically reducing the rabbit population. Decades later, another virus, RHDV, was also used. But the rabbits did not disappear. Their population declined, developed resistance, and began growing again. More than 160 years after Austin's decision, wild rabbits still remain a serious ecological and agricultural problem in Australia. But perhaps the most incredible part of the story is that, several decades later, Australia made a very similar mistake again. This time, with an animal that was supposed to solve a problem. The second story is about Australia's big problem with cane toads. The year is 1935. In northeastern Australia, sugarcane farmers had a serious problem. Beetles were destroying the plantations. Their larvae fed on the roots of the sugarcane, while the adult beetles attacked the plants. The farmers needed a solution, and it seemed they had found one. In other parts of the world, cane toads had been used as a form of biological pest control. The idea was very simple. Bring in the toads. They would eat the beetles. The plantations would be saved. In 1935, a small group of cane toads was brought from Hawaii to Queensland. They were bred in captivity, and by August, around 2,400 young toads were released near Gordonvale. But there was a problem that clearly had not been studied carefully enough. The toads were not particularly good at catching the beetles they had been brought in to control. The beetle larvae lived underground, while the adult beetles were often high up on the sugarcane stalks. The toads mostly stayed on the ground. In other words, the animal brought in to solve the problem barely solved it at all. Instead, it created an entirely new one. Cane toads are extremely adaptable. They eat insects, other frogs, and a wide variety of small animals. They reproduce quickly, but they also have another trait that made them especially dangerous to Australian predators. They are poisonous, and not only as adults. Their eggs, tadpoles, and adult bodies can all contain toxins. For animals in South and Central America that evolved alongside them, cane toads were not completely unfamiliar. But Australian predators had never encountered an animal like this before. Lizards, snakes, crocodiles, and some mammals tried to eat them. For some of these animals, that attempt could be fatal. Instead of controlling a single species of insect, cane toads began affecting the entire food chain. And then they started to spread. From Queensland, they gradually expanded thousands of kilometers across northern Australia. Today, they can be found in Queensland, the Northern Territory, New South Wales, and Western Australia. People collect them. They set traps. They destroy their eggs and tadpoles. Scientists have spent decades trying to find ways to control them. But there is one major problem. Once an invasive species occupies such a vast area, completely removing it becomes almost impossible. The Australian government now openly states that there is no method capable of eradicating cane toads across the entire continent. Instead, research is increasingly focused on protecting the most vulnerable native animals and reducing the damage caused by the toads. An animal introduced to eat a few species of beetles became one of the most famous examples of failed biological control in the world. But the third story is different. Because camels were not brought to Australia to control another animal, they actually did exactly what they had been brought there to do. The problem only began when people no longer needed them. Much of Australia's interior is a vast, dry, and unforgiving landscape. During the 19th century, crossing these regions was an enormous challenge. Horses were not ideal for long journeys across desert terrain, so people found an animal that was: the camel. The first camels arrived in Australia as early as 1840. Over the following decades, thousands of camels were brought in, mainly from Asia. Experienced handlers also arrived with them from regions that are now Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and other parts of Asia. They carried food, water, building materials, equipment, mail. Between 1840 and the beginning of the 20th century, between 10,000 and 20,000 camels were imported into Australia. For decades, they were indispensable. Then technology advanced. Railways were built. Cars and trucks appeared. Suddenly, thousands of animals that had once been extremely valuable were no longer needed. Some were sold, but many were simply released into the wild. For camels, the Australian desert was an almost ideal habitat, and almost nothing naturally controlled their population. They began to reproduce. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. By 2008, it was estimated that around 1 million feral camels were roaming Australia's interior. But the problem was not just their numbers. Camels eat large amounts of desert vegetation and can have a major impact on plant life. During droughts, they gather around water sources and compete with native animals for extremely limited resources. They can contaminate and damage watering points. They damage fences and infrastructure. and their movement through fragile desert environments contributes to land degradation. Because of this, Australia launched large-scale programs to control their population. Between 2009 and 2013, more than 160,000 feral camels were removed as part of a major national project, significantly reducing their numbers. Even so, they did not disappear. Hundreds of thousands of feral camels still live in Australia today, and without population control, their numbers can rise very quickly again. And so, an animal that once helped people explore and connect Australia's vast interior has become yet another invasive species whose population must be continuously managed. Rabbits, cane toads, camels. 3 different animals, 3 human decisions, and consequences that Australia is still dealing with today. None of them were introduced with the intention of causing a disaster. But when a new species enters an ecosystem that is not prepared for it, the consequences can be almost impossible to predict. A decision that takes only a few minutes can change the nature of an entire continent, for decades, or even centuries. I'm Alex. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more incredible stories from nature, history, and the world around us still to come.